If there's one thing we can count on from Hollywood, it's the ability to take an idea that's been beaten to death and squeeze even more life out of it. And of course, the hand-wringing around a potential new civil war seemed to have reached its apex maybe 2 or 3 years ago. But that didn't stop, of course, a Hollywood studio from knocking out a trailer for their own American Civil War, the action film. So we're going to be taking a look at the trailer, guys. I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. We're going to try to decide if this thing is realistic, if this speaks to anything genuine, or is just more anxiety inducing media. Let's get into it.
19 states have seceded.
The United States Army ramps up activity.
The White House issued.
Okay, first off, when you see every apocalypse movie has these traffic jam of abandoned cars, and it's not clear that when you have these sort of things, they're generally what you see large numbers of civilian cars destroyed like this are generally an indicator of one of two things. The first is the classic 1991 Gulf War, the so-called Highway of Death, where the Iraqi military was just fleeing in chaos out of Kuwait along the only highway back to Iraq, and the U.S. military basically just absolutely destroyed the entire Iraqi military. And this is basically what it looked like because they were in such chaos. There was no military discipline, and the vehicle after vehicle was just shredded. You also, of course, have like the natural disaster effect, where the people in these cars stuck in a traffic jam realize they aren't safe in their cars, and they get out and flee. That looks like what they're trying to depict here. Like there was some sort of maybe firefight up ahead, and maybe all these cars left, but then some are like destroyed randomly. It doesn't make a ton of sense.
Issued warnings to the Western forces as well as the Florida Alliance.
One other thing that I thought think is really interesting that we don't appreciate here is that in modern war zones are defined by the presence of what's either IEDs or mines, basically. These are improvised explosives meant to block or disrupt anyone from passing through a given path or passageway. And if there were any kind of real conflict, see, literally it says right here on the sign. See that? Mines ahead. If something says mines ahead, what you want to look for is a cleared path. And not a path that's clear of cars, right? Because if you were going to put mines to block vehicles from passing through, you would put them in the areas where there aren't already obstacles. So what you would want to do is look for an area that's already been cleared. Generally, those are marked by white marking. So you could do white painted stones, you could do white signposts, but white is generally the universal sign for this route has been cleared. If you see a sign that says mines ahead, what you do is turn around.
The Alliance.
The three-term president assures the uprising will be dealt with swiftly.
Let me know if you want to try anything on.
Are you guys aware there's like a pretty huge civil war going on all across America?
We just try to stay out. With what we see on the news, seems like it's for the best.
Yeah, that's a classic one. Again, for a while, there was this idea sort of circulating in the media that everyone had to do something in the face of whatever the big cause was. You couldn't sit on the sidelines. But the reality is, in every conflict zone, the vast, vast majority of people, they cannot become involved in these big national problems. For most people, they wake up every day, they ask themselves, how do I feed my family? How do I take care of my loved ones? How do I make sure that I and the people around me have what they need? And for most people, that consumes their entire thoughts, their entire energy for a given day. So this idea that everybody has some sort of responsibility to solve some big global super problem is one of those things that is a sort of Western, wealthy Western distortion of the truth. If you've been in any kind of developing country like in Afghanistan, the truth is the vast majority of Afghans were motivated simply by their desire to protect their families, to keep them safe, to make sure there was food on the table, and to make sure that and to not put themselves in a situation where they were going to be harmed. And you can't fault people for that, right? That's what being just like a peace-loving person is. And frankly, you probably wouldn't want to live in a country where every single person abandoned their work, their responsibilities, their family, their loved ones, and engaged in some kind of violent confrontation with a perceived enemy. Okay, A24, all right, got it.
Citizens of America, the so-called Western forces of Texas and California.
Okay, so one thing that I thought was interesting is that it's unusual to see the term so-called. The reason is because generally what you will do if you are the nation state and you have a separatist movement is you don't want to if you don't want to legitimize them. And so you almost never see them use terms that they describe themselves, right? Famously, ISIS in the media was referred to by the United States government as Daesh or Daesh. That's because you might recall ISIS, the Islamic State of Syria, Iraq, and Syria. That's what they wanted to be seen as. They want to be seen as a legitimate state. They put it right there in their name. So when you called them ISIS, you were empowering them by saying, hey, you are the state you claim to be. That's why the U.S. invented this sort of nonsense gobbledygook phrase, Daesh or Daesh, right? It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any kind of even proximate synonym in Arabic. And that's not an accident. It's to make sure that they sound like just nothing. They sound like gobbledygook, right? So you would never see this sort of thing from a politician. They would probably refer to them as, they would either diminish them. So they would say, oh, a small treasonous element in California, right? Or you would say, oh, a number of, you wouldn't even call them governors, a number of rogue individuals, have seized power in these states and were working at detaining these criminals. You would use words like criminals or treasonous, and probably if they were a real threat, you would see the person in power almost always diminishes them. Again, you see it, for example, with Putin and his language directed at Ukraine. You see it with the Burmese junta and, about the anti-military rebels. They really do their best to refer to them as criminals. They would never just address them by their own name.
California have suffered a very great defeat at the hands of the United States military.
Mr. President, do you regret the use of airstrikes against American citizens?
Okay, one thing I want to point out that sort of bothers me is that I understand that for movie making purposes, this is very dramatic to have the planes fly this low. There's no reason to have aircraft fly this low. If you have air superiority, then you fly high in the sky. And that gives you a better ability to guide your weapon systems on a target. It also gives you the ability to reduce the likelihood of, for example, when they're flying this low, an individual with a high-powered hunting rifle could put a hole in these planes. Lucky shot, sure, it'd be tough to do, but not impossible. But if you're flying at thousands of feet in the air, it is impossible.
We're moving to DC today.
You need to go down.
Okay, real quick, I want to point something out here. This is supposedly a military installation. There's a couple of problems. First and foremost, military installations have security. If they believe this is in a war zone, this needs to have a perimeter. And understand that you don't need to have like big HESCO barriers or big concertina wire, but for as long as you have a base like this established, you need to have a perimeter, a secured perimeter. That could be, roving patrols, but usually it's almost always going to involve at least several strands of concertina wire, some kind of physical barrier to slow infiltration and to make sure that security forces can keep people in and out. You've got, again, like these like convoys running around, the highly organized bee huts. That seems about right. Again, you have also all these Chinooks flying, but it's really hard to get that many birds in the air at once. You would have to have a massive LZ, and there clearly isn't one. Again, I'm not going to say you would never see it, but this is a lot.
You need to go down there.
They shoot journalists on sight in the Capitol. Every instinct in me says this is death. Flooded.
This is some pretty cringy dialogue.
Every time I survived a war zone,
Okay, this is one of those things that's sadly very realistic. One of the things that happens that a lot of people don't understand in civil wars is that when you have a society that crosses this threshold and it says, hey, violence has no consequences, right? If the person is on the other side, a lot of people's personal vendettas, much smaller scale vendettas and rivalries, sort of get caught up into these civil wars. In a lot of cases in places like Africa, for a while, right during the Cold War, classic example, regional tribal level conflicts between ethnic groups or tribes that had been going on for, in some cases, hundreds of years, suddenly got a Cold War flavor. Tribe A would sit there and say, actually, we're anti-communist. And they'd go to the United States and they'd say, I don't know if you knew this, but we're strident anti-communists, and our enemies, Tribe B, they're actually intense communists. And so the U.S. would give Tribe A lots of guns and money and training, and then Tribe B would go, well, they'd knock on the Soviet Union's door and say, hey, you guys may not have noticed this, but we are actually a super communist. We're so communist, guys. And the Soviet Union would give them money. But the truth is that the fights were never about that. They were always be super local. We saw the same thing in Afghanistan. You would have different sub-tribes. Some would align with the Taliban, some would align with the government, but they would fight over things that had literally nothing to do with the rest of the country. They would fight over like who controlled these empty pieces of land or a certain number of farm fields, right? There was no ideology, right? The groups were too small to have some grand national vision. Instead, they just had petty rivalries, and that's what you would see. That's what you do see in a lot of civil wars. Again, you would see people say, "Oh, well, my rival, the rival car dealership owner, he was actually on the other side. He was a secret collaborator, and I caught him, or I outed him as a collaborator or something." It's so typical. It actually features in Thucydides' history, which was written in 400 BC. He talks about a civil war in a number of major cities, and he says that's one of the things that classically happened. Every person who was owed a debt to someone, conveniently, their creditor, lo and behold, was a collaborator with the enemy. Shocker. And once that collaborator was taken care of, or that creditor was taken care of, the debtor's debt was wiped out. Just a lucky benefit from being such a noble patriot, right? But just don't valorize people. That's what I would say. And I see movies like this, and I worry that that's what they're going to do. They're going to depict it as being way more valorous and way more like black and white than it really is.
I thought I was sending a warning. Don't do this. And here we are.
There's some kind of misunderstanding here. What? Well, you're American, okay?
Okay. What kind of American are you?
Okay, here's what's interesting, and I find it sort of bizarre, but a classic move. I think this guy is supposed to be some kind of like parody of a LARPer. I know what they're trying to say with the blonde and the glasses. I know what they're going for. I'm not even going to indulge it. But what I find interesting, and this would be exactly something that a real like LARPer would do. And I say LARPer, a person who loves military shit, but is not served in the military and is not served in a war zone, is the idea. You notice he has no badges of any kind, and that's in the active duty military. If you see that in like a real war zone, it's a sign that this person is part of an organization that does not need to or want to disclose their affiliation, namely like a Delta Force CIA type situation, or it's like in this case, it's like a LARPer. Sometimes you get people who believe their organizations entitle them to that. I saw some people in some federal law enforcement roles where I knew who they were with, and I was like, no one else in your organization strips their patches. You're doing it because you want to LARP like a badass. You shouldn't. But you notice he's awarded himself a combat infantryman's badge. So to wear no patchwork, but to give yourself a U.S. Army award. And you notice he's got blood all over his hands, right? I mean, again, this is like a lot of symbolism, but I think it's funny that it's another classic to just to kill civilians and then pat yourself on the back and be like, I'm a combat hero. And don't get me wrong, In Vietnam, there was some instances of that. Famously, the My Lai massacre was initially reported as a combat engagement, and actually several of the perpetrators of the massacre were actually given combat awards for the action in My Lai, even though it was later revealed to have been entirely a one-sided massacre of civilians.
You don't know?
The Western forces will reach the White House on July 4th.
Oh my God.
Get in the car! Get in the car!
As a general rule, so sometimes press will be in military bases. It's not unheard of. Again, these low flyovers, kind of weird.
Get in the car!
Okay, once again, let's see. Note, there is no LZ here. Well, I'm sorry, there is this LZ in the center, but it's way too small for the number of aircraft we've seen. You see, you could only basically land like maybe 6 more aircraft here in a pinch. And again, notice, absolutely no perimeter security here. None. Which is sort of bothersome.
You're gonna hang back.
Not hanging back.
One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty.
Okay, one thing that I want to point out about this stuff where they're like, they're gonna take the fucking Capitol. Yeah, marching on the Capitol is like a time-tested Civil War move. And in some ways, the symbol is important, but it used to be that the Capitol had physical things that were essential to hold if you wanted to control the country. It would oftentimes be the main hub for rail transportation, for example. And if you held the ability to transport food across the country to distribute it, then you could hold the rest of the country hostage in a very literal way. Similarly, if you controlled the radio outlets or press services or newspapers, you could control what the country heard about or learned about. And so taking these central areas was really essential. In the modern era, it's somewhat less important. You can, make government functions occur in other cities, remotely, in dispersed locations. You saw that in Ukraine, right? The government evacuated Kiev and has been operating out of Lviv, by and large, for some time, for the better part of 2 years. And, if Russia had successfully taken Kiev, it's not clear that would have spelled the end of Ukraine's resistance against the Russian occupation. But what it would have done is allowed Russia to symbolically put their own puppet in Kiev. And sometimes that, again, these symbolic victories become literal battlefield victories where real lives are sacrificed to achieve a symbolic win. This is where, again, civil wars get really complicated, especially when they're large in scale. They don't end quickly in the modern era. Look at, for example, the Yemeni civil war. Once both sides have their benefactors who will give them arms, then the civil war sort of becomes a stalemate. Look at the Libyan civil war, which still hasn't reached any kind of meaningful resolution, or the Syrian civil war, which has only recently begun to sort of congeal itself a little bit into some sort of winner. But you see how, states also are subject to entropy, right? It's very hard to build a car. It's very easy to wreck a car. States are infinitely more complex than a car. And so it's hard to build a functioning state, and it can be really easy to destroy that state. And it doesn't require, like, breaking apart those systems in some ways can be easy. But creating a civil war is easy. Winning a civil war is really, really hard, right? Because winning it means one party has put the state back together. Does that make sense at all? Like, it's easy to start a civil war. It's hard to finish one. As we talked about, aircraft, you should not operate that low. The Taliban have only killed taken out 4 Apaches in the 20 years that the Afghan war took place, or 4 helicopters. And every time it's when the helicopters are flying very low, so low that small arms fire could be deployed. And you notice when the helicopter is this low, it's doing the exact same thing that a tank could do. And this is why we have tanks. We don't need helicopters. we have tanks. Helicopters stay really high in the air and they provide close air support, but they don't literally get that close.
And justice for all.
The military also has a pretty strict prohibition on preserving cultural heritage sites. For example, mosques, Iraqi mosques, we did everything in our power to not touch them. And very historic mosque sites, they'd been destroyed, but they'd been destroyed by insurgent attacks. Usually, for example, sites sacred to the Shia would be destroyed by Sunni insurgents, and sites sacred to the Sunnis would be in turn destroyed by the Shia. But the U.S. military worked tirelessly to preserve the cultural heritage of the countries where we are at war. So the fact that the U.S. would even consider a strike on somewhere, a monument in D.C. Also, if you know anything about D.C., you know that the National Mall is like, yeah, it's kind of sort of close to the White House, but like you wouldn't. It just isn't that suitable for a place to hold like a headquarters, right? Like it's too open. If you knew that someone else had air superiority, then you would put your headquarters like under a building. There's a gazillion reinforced bunkers. The entire DC metro system would make a better headquarters. Anything would make a better headquarters than the National Mall.
God bless America.
Yeah, all in all, guys, this stuff always irks me. It's dramatic. It's stylized. It's what happens when you have a Hollywood writer trying to actually forecast what would really happen in the event of a breakdown of civil order in the United States. And I wouldn't give any of it too much credibility. And again, I'm always sort of bothered by the Hollywoodification of real tragedies, right? Civil wars. I mean, you see 10 million Syrians had to flee their civil war, upended a whole change the politics of Europe, changed the power balance in the Middle East, changed the U.S.-Russia dynamic fundamentally, changed the relationship between NATO and Turkey. In addition to just an absolutely eye-watering number of lives lost. And yeah, when you see it get Hollywoodified, it always kind of bothers me. Anyway, guys, that's really all I had for you. If you're interested in some premium content, I do deep dive analysis of real war content, not salacious, but to understand it. So you can check us out, combatvetnews.com. It's like my premium membership. And of course, a huge thank you to all the members of combatvetnews.com, to all you guys, all of our Colonel tier members, our Lieutenant tier members. Be sure to hit like and subscribe, guys. I appreciate you tuning in, and I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.